Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. Most police officers start off as patrol officers, and a typical day would include assisting in emergency scenes, responding to burglaries, and monitoring the roadways and stopping cars that are driving erratically or speeding. For every incident that occurs, the police officer is required to file a report. However, some days do not follow a normal pattern, where they may see something out of the ordinary that could be intriguing or downright terrifying. The following are 3 frightening stories that were reported by police whilst on duty. The staring intruder. One evening a few years ago, the police received a phone call from an elderly woman who lived alone, saying that she kept hearing footsteps in her house, both downstairs and also walking upstairs, and she believed the footsteps were coming from a ghost. To ease the woman's fears and to check for possible intruders, 2 police officers were sent out to investigate. It was a rainy night as the officers left the station and headed to the elderly lady's house. To help with the lady's fears, the 911 operator suggested that she stay on the line until the officers reached her house. About 3 minutes after the woman made the call, and while still on the line, she told the operator that she could see a man standing in her backyard, and he was just staring at her through a sliding glass door. Now absolutely petrified, the elderly woman was frozen in fear as he continued to stare at her, and she stared back at him. Fortunately, the operator continued to communicate with the woman as she continued to describe her horror story. She said that he was just standing there as still as could be, then all of a sudden slowly walked away. 12 minutes after her initial phone call, the police finally arrived and came into the house via the front door. Whilst one officer stayed with the woman to offer comfort, the other officer went out to the backyard to see if he could see any trace of the man and whether he was hiding somewhere, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The officers then decided to do a thorough search of her house to ensure that it had not managed to enter her property. When they reached the living room, they discovered a trail of footprints and mud on the floor. They asked the woman whether she'd been outside the house at all that day or whether she'd received any visitors. The woman said that she'd not been outside all day and that she lived alone and nobody had visited her that day. She also claimed she had very poor eyesight. After a short discussion, the officers came to the realization that the woman had definitely seen a man's reflection in the sliding glass door, but had mistakenly believed that he was outside on the other side of the glass in the backyard. However, the fact of the matter was that the man had actually been standing close to her in the same room while she'd been talking to 911 on the phone. She had not realized the man was standing close to her due to her poor eyesight. On further inspection, it appears that nothing was stolen, broken, or out of place, and could not figure out what his intention could have been. However, what could have saved her from something more serious was that she stayed on the line with the operator. Unfortunately, the police had arrived quickly. Eyes in the mirror. One evening, a police officer who had been off duty was driving to a friend's house. He was an experienced officer who, over the years, had developed a kind of sixth sense. While he was driving, he saw a vehicle standing alone in the middle of a church parking lot and initially figured the car was driven by young people just hanging around, which many like to do, but nevertheless decided to check things out. He then drove to the side of the vehicle, but could not see anyone sitting inside. He then drove around to the rear of the vehicle to check the number plate, thinking that it may have been stolen and dumped in the parking lot. He decided to write down the number plate, and as he looked up, he noticed that someone was now sitting in the driver's seat and appeared to be observing him through the rearview mirror. As a police officer, this is something you look out for when you stop vehicles, to see how intently someone may be watching you from inside the car and whether they were going to try something. It was at this point that his flesh started to crawl, because only minutes earlier he had thoroughly checked the inside of the car to see if there was anyone sitting inside, and it was definitely empty. To seek further reassurance and prove to himself that he was not imagining things, he again drove alongside the vehicle and could see that there was absolutely nobody inside. The following day he returned to the parking lot, but the car was gone. The officer had no idea what he'd seen the previous night and was sure that when he went to check on the number plate, he could clearly see a person's eyes looking straight back at him. Whenever he was on duty and on quiet nights, he and his partner would often sit outside the church in that parking lot because it was tucked away and they could relax. The officer no longer parked there. A cold and rainy night. The following incident happened to a female police officer one rainy night in autumn. It was 9 p.m. and the weather was quite cold. At the time, it was raining so heavily that the windscreen wipers had a hard time keeping up with the teeming rain. The officer was working as a patrol deputy and was assigned to a small county that had just over 370,000 people. Although it was a fairly small community, it had its fair share of haunted locations, where some were just hearsay but others were well documented. The deputy was having a hard time looking through the windshield as the rain pounded the glass and decided to turn off of Lone Rock Road and head for Powell Road towards Tall Pines Park, which has many acres of dense woods. When the weather was sunny and clear, she often enjoyed sitting in the parking lot, enjoying the view as she did her paperwork. Across from the park stood a nursing home, and the closest house was about 3 blocks down on the opposite side of the road. One of the officer's duties whilst on night shift was to close the park at dusk and to ensure that there were no people still in the park. However, since it was pouring down with rain, she did not expect to find anyone walking in the park on such a dreadful night. But she was wrong. She had no sooner pulled into Lone Rock Road when she could see 2 people walking across the road. They were both wearing jackets with hoods up over their heads. The officer thought it highly unusual to see anyone walking in such torrential rain at that time of night without an umbrella and walking towards the Tall Pines Park and into the dense woods of all places. She decided to pull up next to the couple and lowered her passenger side window and called out, "Everything okay?" She could see a man in his late 40s who leaned on the car window and said, "I was taking my mother for a walk. We're now heading home." But there was something weird about the tone in his voice. It was dull and sounded robotic. She thought, why were they going for a walk in the middle of a downpour? The man then continued to talk in a strange monotone and said, "We live in the first house on the left." He then straightened up, and moments later, an elderly woman's face appeared at the car window. She said, "Thank you," in the same lifeless voice as the man's. She then moved away from the car as the officer rolled up the car window. The officer began to drive away, but then remembered the man saying that they lived in the first house on the left, and she abruptly stopped the car in the road. There is no house on the left, only Tall Pines Park on that side. She looked up at the rearview mirror, but the couple were not there. She moved the mirror left and right, but still she could not see them. She then grabbed the flashlight and got out of the car and shone the light all around, but there was no sign of the 2 people. Where did they go? She then got back in the car and drove around the area. How could they have disappeared so fast in such a short period of time? There was simply nowhere for them to have gone in that short time frame. Certainly not into the park or down the street. They had vanished. She later asked other deputies if they'd ever seen the couple or if they knew anyone that lived on that sparsely populated road with that description, but none of them had. The officer worked in the same area and small community for another 7 years, and she never ever saw the couple again. So, what did she see on that rainy night, and where did they go?